Some actors own a role so much that any attempt to take it from them completely ruins the character. In some cases, it can totally sink the show. These TV shows and movies took big chances recasting roles, and one way or another, all of them paid the price for it.
Steve Carell was a well-known comic force from The Daily Show and Anchorman before he got his biggest break with the small-screen comedy series The Office. The show was an American adaptation of the Ricky Gervais BBC sitcom of the same name and became wildly popular with audiences. Carell's film career started to take off shortly thereafter, with starring roles in movies like The 40-Year-Old Virgin, Little Miss Sunshine, and Crazy Stupid Love, elevating him to household name status. So, in 2013, when Carell's contract with The Office was up, he opted to walk away from the series, even though it was still a critical and ratings hit for NBC. The awkward, lovelorn Michael Scott finally found love with HR director Holly, and they moved away to Colorado. But Dunder Mifflin still needed a boss, and that came in the form of oily, unsettling Robert California, CEO of its parent company, Sabre.
Well, I will not be blackmailed by some ineffectual, privileged, effete, soft debutante.
And it was all downhill from there. The show's critical favor and viewership numbers took a nosedive, and the series finally came to a close after 2 Carell-free seasons. After 7 seasons of riding on a high, ratings-wise at least, 2 of that 70 show's main stars decided to step away from the series. Topher Grace decided to leave the show in order to more fiercely pursue his blossoming film career and was written out of the 8th season altogether. Meanwhile, Ashton Kutcher decided his time in the bell-bottoms was done too, but did appear for a few of Season 8's early episodes. To replace 2 very big holes in the cast, producers hired Mad TV veteran Josh Myers. His character, Randy, joins Hyde's record store Grooves and has a brief relationship with Donna. But Randy didn't have much time to mesh with the ensemble because the decimated cast led to diminished popularity for the show, and it was ultimately canned at the end of the season.
You have the right to remain.
Even though Community never had a huge audience during its 5-year run on NBC, it was still a critically acclaimed comedy with a passionate cult following. 5 seasons was ultimately NBC's limit, but internet giant Yahoo stepped in and renewed Community for a 6th season, intending to position the comedy as a premiere offering on its streaming service Yahoo Screen. Original regulars Joe McHale, Jillian Jacobs, Danny Pudi, Ken Jeong, and Allison Brie followed the series to Yahoo, but the show had already been losing cast members left and right, and kept losing them as it transitioned to streaming. Chevy Chase, Donald Glover, and Yvette Nicole Brown were not part of the regular cast of Community's 6th season. New actors were added, including Keith David and Paget Brewster, but it just didn't work out. And there was no 7th season of Community on Yahoo Screen, or anywhere. Not enough people tuned in, and the show didn't generate as much advertising revenue as Yahoo had hoped. The revenue was so small that it effectively led to the complete shutdown of Yahoo Screen.
Show may be canceled and moved to the internet where it turns out tens of millions were watching the whole time. May not matter. Fake commercial may end with disclaimer gag which may descend into vain Chuck Lorre-esque rant by narcissistic creator.
The Prisoner of Azkaban might still be a favorite among some Harry Potter fans, thanks to the arrival of Sirius Black and that wild Whomping Willow. But the fact remains that it's the lowest grossing movie in the franchise, and for many, the subdued enthusiasm seems to stem from the unfortunate arrival of a new Hogwarts headmaster in the film. Richard Harris's take on Albus Dumbledore in the first 2 movies had become definitive for Potter fans, so when the actor died after a battle with Hodgkin's disease, the filmmakers had to turn to another actor to step into the beloved professor's cloak. Michael Gambon seemed like a fine choice to conjure up for the franchise, but his performance in his first run as Dumbledore was stunted by the fact that he never read the books. Rather than resuming Harris's spellbindingly calm and wise demeanor, Gambon delivered a much more stern and aggressive version of the character for his first few outings.
Harry, did you put your name in a goblet of fire?
No, sir.
You asked one of the oldest students to do it for you?
No, sir.
You're absolutely sure?
Gambon would later summon up the same sort of chill pill that saved the role from being ruined for children across the globe. But these moments of mismatching between the beloved book character and the screen interpretation still cost the movies many house points in the eyes of the true Potter fanatics. Few actors perfectly embody their comic book counterparts quite like the cast of Marvel Cinematic Universe's Phase 1. Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man, Chris Evans as Captain America, and Samuel L. Jackson as Nick Fury were certainly inspired, as was Edward Norton as Bruce Banner, aka the Incredible Hulk. Appearing as the angry green giant in 2008's The Incredible Hulk, Norton's portrayal of the runaway scientist felt ripped from the original Marvel comics themselves. Not only was Norton able to deftly balance Bruce's struggles with mental health and his desire for impossible intimacy, but his Hulk was also fierce, powerful, and best embodied the character's rage. But then Norton exited the MCU, never to return. In 2014, he told The Hollywood Reporter, "My feeling was that I experimented and experienced what I wanted to. I really enjoyed it. And yet, I looked at the balance of time and life that one spends not only making those sorts of films, but then especially putting them out, and the obligations that rightly come with that. So for 2012's grand team-up featured The Avengers, Marvel recast Mark Ruffalo as Bruce Banner.
That's my secret, Cap. I'm always angry.
Ruffalo has played the reluctant hero ever since, but unfortunately, his more comedic take on the character feels too far removed from Norton's intricately complex dive into Bruce Banner's psyche. In this case, at least, it seems like the MCU opted for style over substance. Another error in judgment from the Batman universe occurred when Michael Keaton handed over the keys for Wayne Manor to Val Kilmer. Keaton had portrayed the role in 1989's Batman and its sequel Batman Returns, but he refused to reprise the role in a third film after reading the screenplay. When pressed for details, Keaton later said that the script he was shown sucked, and that it was just awful, pointing the blame for his departure squarely at the writers. Val Kilmer clearly didn't share Keaton's opinion. The Tombstone star accepted the role and went into the film knowing he'd have to contend with a wide cast of wacky villains, as well as a new director. Joel Schumacher ultimately shouldered a lot of the blame for the badness of Batman Forever, though his leading man didn't escape criticism.
What am I?
Please! You're as blind as a bat!
He was quickly replaced with George Clooney in Batman and Robin. The good news for Kilmer is that Clooney's turn as the Dark Knight wasn't any more loved than his own, and soon everyone forgot about Kilmer's turn in the Batmobile.
Forget it, take it off. It's Val Kilmer.
Oh, you're an actor.
Billy D. Williams played a pre-disfigured version of Harvey Dent in Tim Burton's 1989 Batman. Dent's appearance was no doubt meant to tease the character's on-screen future as Two-Face, a turn he finally made in Batman Forever. But in that film, it wasn't Williams facing off against the Dark Knight, but Tommy Lee Jones. But many forget that Williams' Dent and Jones's Two-Face are meant to be one and the same.
Very few people are both a summer and a winter, but you pull it off nicely.
Of course, there's a clear difference between the two iterations of the character. Appearance aside, Williams' Dent is a charismatic leader, hoping to use his status to change the hearts and minds of voters. On the contrary, Jones's Two-Face isn't much more than a maniacal sidekick to Jim Carrey's over-the-top Riddler, which only makes Batman Forever feel all the more outlandish. Roger Ebert may have once deemed Forever better than Batman Returns, but the movie's strange tone and misuse of Tommy Lee Jones make it a controversial bat flick to this day. In 2021, DC Comics published a comic continuation to Batman and Batman Returns that follows the Michael Keaton incarnation of the Dark Knight. Written by Batman screenwriter Sam Hamm, the series revives Williams' version of Harvey Dent and chronicles the character's troubled turn into Two-Face, thus establishing the events of Forever as an alternate timeline. Live-action Bruce Waynes tend to find a new love interest in each installment of the Batman franchise. From Kim Basinger's Vicky Vale to Nicole Kidman's Dr. Chase Meridian, The Dark Knight certainly gets around. But for Christopher Nolan's visionary take on the character's origins, a new Bat-love was born. In 2005's Batman Begins, Katie Holmes played Bruce Wayne's childhood friend turned love interest, Rachel Dawes. At the end of the film, Rachel tells Bruce that they can only be together when Gotham City no longer needs Batman, setting up an intriguing arc for the two characters. However, Holmes quit Nolan's Batman sequel in favor of the buddy comedy Mad Money. She was replaced by Maggie Gyllenhaal in The Dark Knight. No doubt, Gyllenhaal delivers an excellent performance, and she certainly fits the tone of the sequel, but it's hard to believe that this Rachel is the same character as Holmes. Not only is Gyllenhaal's Rachel more cavalier than her Begins counterpart, but she doesn't seem as personally invested in Bruce as she did before. Sure, some of that is due to plot reasons, namely her romance with Harvey Dent, but it also may be that Gyllenhaal simply didn't have the same chemistry with Christian Bale as her predecessor.
When Suits hit airwaves in 2011, critics had positive but somewhat mixed reviews on the premise, which turned the tired legal drama format on its head with the introduction of Mike Ross, a wannabe lawyer without a degree, and Harvey Specter, the hotshot attorney who mentored him. Shot in Toronto, the series wound up being a massive hit for the network and was considered the last of its Blue Skies era.
Hey, you ready for this? Yeah, I am.
However, that all ended in 2017, when Patrick J. Adams and Meghan Markle, who played Mike Ross and his love interest, Rachel Zane, respectively, announced they were leaving the show after 7 seasons. At that point, another original series star, Gina Torres, also exited, leaving the cast down 3 members. As a result, the show brought on Dule Hill and Katherine Heigl, while upping Amanda Schull from recurring to full-time status in Season 8. However, the new mix of characters didn't resonate as well as the old school ones, and the show wrapped for good in Season 9. Now, this is a story all about how the casting on Fresh Prince got turned upside down. Fans everywhere are familiar with the behind-the-scenes strife that went down between Will Smith and original Aunt Viv actress Janet Hubert, who played the role for 3 notable seasons before refusing to renew her contract under what she considered to be a bad deal. As a result, she exited the show, and she was replaced by Daphne Maxwell Reid, an actor who was originally considered for the role but refused to audition because a TV show starring a young rapper didn't sound like her thing.
There are a lot of sick, demented perverts out there.
Greetings, all.
Although The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air went on for 3 more seasons with the new Aunt Viv, there was no replacing Hubert's comedic timing. Later, when Smith got the gang back together for the 2020 reunion, he and Hubert sat down for the first time to finally iron things out. The result was the 2 Aunt Vivs meeting for the very first time, as many fans wondered what the show could have been had Hubert stayed on after all. It's no secret that the children on Tim Allen's Last Man Standing changed pretty drastically over the show's run. Amanda Fuller joined the project in Season 2 as Kristen Baxter, replacing Alexandra Krosny, who originated the role. Then there's the fact that 4 different actors have played the part of Kristen's son, Boyd, as the character has aged over the years. But it was Molly Ephraim's exit from the series following Season 6 that really threw Last Man Standing fans for a loop. As middle child Mandy, Ephraim had her share of meaty storylines that made her a show fixture. But when ABC canceled Last Man Standing in 2017 and Fox revived it for a 7th season run, Ephraim didn't go with it. She had signed up for new projects and was unable to return. Molly McCook was cast in her place. And although the series lasted 3 seasons on Fox before its cancellation in 2021, the character was just never the same.
From 1998 to 2007, Kevin James and Leah Remini starred on the popular CBS sitcom King of Queens. James would go on to star in a string of movies like Grown Ups and Paul Blart Mall Cop, but in 2016 he returned to the weekly CBS sitcom grind with Kevin Can Wait. James portrayed Kevin Gable, a family man who has to delay retiring from his police job due to family and money issues. Playing opposite James was Erin Hayes as Kevin's wife Donna Gable. At least that's how it was for the first season. Kevin Can Wait producers revamped the show for Season 2. They killed off Donna Gable and fired Hayes. James explained the decision to the New York Daily News by saying, "We were literally just running out of ideas." They also brought in a new face, who was really a familiar face. Surprisingly, Leah Remini joined Kevin Can Wait as Kevin's business partner, Vanessa. However, the nostalgic rebooting couldn't overcome the weird behind-the-scenes shakeup, and ratings actually dropped in Season 2. After the conclusion of the sitcom's second ill-fated season, CBS didn't wait to cancel Kevin. Step by Step was an ABC sitcom about Carol and Frank Lambert, 2 single parents who bring their families together. In addition to all their kids, Frank's nephew Cody lived in a van outside the house. Cody was a good-natured, airheaded California dude, basically a sitcom version of Ted from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure.
And I'm Ted Theodore Logan. Yeah!
Affable and enthusiastic acting by Sasha Mitchell made the character a fan favorite, but in 1995, when Mitchell was arrested for spousal assault, he was convicted later that year and sentenced to 3 years of probation and spousal abuse counseling. Mitchell wound up behind bars for violating his parole. and reportedly attacked his wife again. At the beginning of the 6th season of Step by Step, Cody was gone, replaced by Jean-Luc, a heavily accented hairdresser colleague of Carol's. Playing Jean-Luc was Bronson Pinchot, best known for playing the excitable, heavily accented Bulky on Perfect Strangers and the excitable, heavily accented Serge in Beverly Hills Cop. The new cast addition didn't work, and ABC cancelled Step by Step at the end of the season. The show then moved to CBS for a final year, without Pinchot.
In the original X-Men films, team leader Scott Summers was played by James Marsden. Though he was written a bit too much like a jealous boyfriend at times, Marsden did a decent job bringing this Marvel hero to life, especially when it came to his dynamic with Hugh Jackman's Wolverine. But by the time X-Men The Last Stand came around, the actor had decided to star in Superman Returns, forcing Cyclops' untimely demise. Thankfully, once Wolverine fixed the timeline in X-Men Days of Future Past, Scott was resurrected, giving us a new hope for his future. And then he was recast. X-Men Apocalypse, the direct sequel to First Class and Days of Future Past, introduced audiences to a younger Scott Summers, one who has yet to grow into the hero embodied by Marsden in the original trilogy. Played by Ty Sheridan, Cyclops is no longer the field leader of the X-Men, nor does he have much agency in a movie that mostly centers on Xavier, Magneto, and Mystique. Despite Sheridan's struggle to bring Cyclops to life in Apocalypse and its sequel, Dark Phoenix, James Marsden supported his successor, citing the young actor's role in Mud as a particular accomplishment. In 2015, he told HitFix, "I think he's a wonderfully talented actor. I think he's a perfect fit." Many planned Superman projects failed to come to fruition in the years after 1987's resoundingly terrible Superman 4: The Quest for Peace. Nearly 20 years later, The Man of Steel returned to the big screen for 2006's Superman Returns. Director Bryan Singer's take on DC's prized property proved to be a solid enough platform to take the franchise forward, though the vast budget meant that the movie wasn't a financial success. That said, Brandon Routh's turn as the Man of Steel drew praise from many, with Newsweek in particular gushing over Routh for the way in which the newcomer effortlessly lays claim to the iconic role. The outlet even favorably compared him to Christopher Reeve. Although DC intended to produce a sequel to Superman Returns, every year that passed made it less likely to happen. Despite Routh making it quite clear that he wanted to don the red cape again, the studio opted to reboot the franchise with Man of Steel, a Zack Snyder reboot fronted by Henry Cavill. Trouble is, Snyder's film took the aspect of Superman Returns that people didn't like, the morose, humorless tone, and amplified it. Cavill's downbeat portrayal of the titular hero has been criticized for being too brooding and too dark, leading to a Superman film that's practically devoid of joy. Halle Berry taking over Michelle Pfeiffer's role in Catwoman is perhaps the most infamous example of recasting going terribly wrong. DC's leather-clad heroine has appeared in numerous Batman adaptations over the years, but Pfeiffer's psychotically sexy performance in Tim Burton's Batman Returns remains the cat's meow.
I don't know about you, Miss Kitty, but I feel so much yummier.
The actress initially intended to reprise the role in the Solo spin-off, but after years of development woes, her patience reached its limit and she decided to concentrate on other commitments. After a rigorous recruiting process, Berry was ultimately chosen to climb into the catsuit, and what a mess it all was. The film was a complete disaster, bombing hard at the box office while cleaning up at the Razzies. Berry took her worst actress win in good humor and even turned up to accept her award in person. For its first 6 seasons, The X-Files was a huge hit for Fox and made its on-screen pair of paranormal investigators international stars. But prior to the start of the series' 7th season, David Duchovny sued the network, claiming that it had sold rights to reruns of the show at a discount to its own affiliates and cheated the stars out of profits. While the lawsuit was eventually settled, it was filed right when Duchovny was negotiating working on future seasons of the show, and neither he nor Fox were keen to continue working together. So, a deal was reached. Duchovny's character, Fox Mulder, would mysteriously disappear at the end of Season 7, and would only appear in a handful of episodes in Season 8. But Gillian Anderson's Agent Scully still needed someone to work with in his absence, so producers auditioned dozens of actors and eventually settled on Robert Patrick to come in as FBI agent John Doggett. Another actress was also hired in case Anderson decided to leave the show after her contract ended too. It didn't matter much though, because without Duchovny in his regular role, viewers tuned out.
You saved me. As difficult and as frustrating as it's been sometimes, your damn strict rationalism and science have saved me 1,000 times over.
This comedy about medical interns desperately trying to figure out what they were doing as they worked in a hospital was a critically acclaimed, Emmy-nominated hit over its first few seasons on NBC. The network dropped the show after 7 seasons, only to see ABC pick it up. The show's writers and cast prepared a true series finale at the end of the year, only for ABC to unexpectedly renew the series again for season 9. But star Zach Braff, the focus of the show as young Dr. John Dorian, was ready to move on to other things.
Onward! Eagle!
Oh, good God.
So the show was retooled and rebooted, no longer taking place at a teaching hospital, but at a medical school. Dr. Cox and Dr. Turk were now teachers instead of active surgeons.
I'm just back to teach some classes.
Replacing Braff as the center of the show and narrator was Dr. Lucy Bennett, but the big changes were too much to take, and the 9th season of Scrubs was also its last. This ABC sitcom was forced to reformat after the unexpected death of its star. 8 Simple Rules was built around TV legend John Ritter, who starred as a cranky suburban dad desperately trying to rein in his wild teenage children. Filming had just begun on the 2nd season of the series when Ritter fell ill on the set and sought medical treatment. He died later that day of a heart defect that had never been diagnosed. ABC announced that the show would go on, and it did, with some necessary changes. No longer a show about a cranky dad, it became one about a family trying to pick up the pieces after the death of its patriarch. 2 new stars joined the cast to fill the void left by Ritter, cousin CJ and Grandpa Jim. But without Ritter, the show only lasted another season before being shelved for good. Actor-musician Steve Burns beat out roughly 1,000 other actors in 1996 for the only human role on Blue's Clues, Nickelodeon's interactive animation live-action hybrid show for preschoolers. Burns played the striped-shirted host and owner of the cartoon dog named Blue. He talked directly to the young viewers at home, urging them to help solve each episode's riddle or mystery by yelling things at their screens. In 2002, after about 100 episodes, Burns decided it was time to leave the series. He wanted to take on other roles as well as perform music. Nickelodeon hired actor Donovan Patton to be the new host of Blue's Clues, playing Steve's younger brother, Joe. So as not to traumatize or confuse the show's very young viewers, Steve carefully explained that he was leaving for college and Joe would be looking after Blue. Patton as Joe proved to be the gentle and affable host Blue's Clues needed, but he just couldn't replace someone so closely associated with the role to an army of toddlers. After around 50 episodes with Patton as Joe, Blue's Clues was canceled. Today, Back to the Future stands as a timeless classic that continues to delight audiences of all ages. Crispin Glover played the role of Marty's father, George, in arguably his most iconic role. From cowardly creep to confident ladies' man, George undergoes the most significant transformation in the trilogy, both on and off camera. In fact, some might not even realize that Glover didn't return for Back to the Future Part 2, in which he was replaced by Jeffrey Weissman, wearing Glover-inspired prosthetics. Despite having fully recast Jennifer Parker for the sequels, the filmmakers opted to hide their new George McFly via prosthetics and clever filmmaking techniques that made it nearly impossible to spot the fake. Originally, co-writer and co-producer Bob Gale claimed that Glover quit due to a pay dispute, but Glover himself has denied this on a number of occasions. Instead, he says, he was removed from the burgeoning franchise after voicing his distaste for the ending of the original movie, which he believed implied that the McFly's happiness was dependent on material wealth.
Whoa, this is heavy.
For Part 2, the filmmakers spliced footage of Glover's performance from the first film, added new material with Weissman, and killed off George McFly in the alternate 1985 to keep audiences from discovering the truth. It worked well enough, but upon rewatch, it's clear how hard director Robert Zemeckis tried to hide the fact that Glover wasn't involved. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Glover was less than thrilled about his face being used without his permission. Years later, he told the AV Club they thought that was funny. They knew that they could basically torment me, either financially or by what ultimately was an illegal thing to do. I'm sure they laughed and joked about it. Hugo Weaving's absence was sorely felt in The Matrix Resurrections. That's not to say that Jonathan Groff, who replaced Weaving as the villainous program known as Smith, is not a talented actor. Sadly, he had huge shoes to fill. Even in Reloaded and Revolutions, Weaving shines brightest among the cast, while Ian Bliss tackles an inspired impersonation when the character takes over a human host. But the fourth time was not the charm.
Mr. Anderson!
Considering Weaving's iconic turn as Smith, a new version of the character needed to feel either identical or significantly different from the original in order to work. Unfortunately, Groff's portrayal in Resurrections is neither. Deemed an algorithm of unoriginality by The Guardian, the fourth Matrix movie failed to recapture what made the relationship between Neo and Smith so special, and that's due at least in part to Weaving's absence. Weaving wasn't the only actor replaced in The Matrix Resurrections. Lawrence Fishburne played Morpheus in all three installments of the original trilogy, as well as the in-canon Matrix Online video game, which chronicled the character's death. Because of his work in The Matrix, Fishburne has become a Hollywood staple. He even reunited with former co-star Keanu Reeves on multiple occasions in the John Wick series.
At last.
Rather than keep Morpheus in the grave, The Matrix Resurrections resurrects the character, now played by Yahya Abdul-Mateen II.
At last. I wasn't too sure about the callback, but it's just
Much like Agent Smith's recasting, Abdul-Mateen makes a valiant attempt to bring Morpheus back to life. This Morpheus isn't the original, but rather a program meant to help Neo achieve his destiny, which makes this red pill a little easier to swallow. Nevertheless, the lack of Fishburne no doubt contributed to the critical and commercial failures of Resurrections. Every Matrix sequel has proved that it's nearly impossible to recapture what made the original great, but at least the first two follow-ups retained most of their original casts. Compared to the first two James Cameron films, it's understandable why most folks dislike Terminator 3: Rise of the Machines. The movie tries a bit too hard with the jokes, and aside from John Connor's compelling character arc, it doesn't really break any new ground. Still, one of the strongest aspects of T3 is the budding romance between John and a young Kate Brewster, who learns all about Skynet, Terminators, and Judgment Day just a day or so before it occurs.
The end of the world. It's today, 3 hours from now.
2 hours and 53 minutes.
So when the movie ends and John and Kate are trapped underground, we're left to wonder, what's next? Half a decade later, Terminator Salvation replaced Nick Stahl's John Connor with Christian Bale, and Claire Danes' Kate Brewster with Bryce Dallas Howard. Compared to Danes, Howard's portrayal is fairly one-note, though to be fair, she isn't given half as much to do as her predecessor. Salvation barely even centers around John Connor, let alone Kate, so it's no surprise that Howard had little to work with. In a 2009 interview with Cinema Blend, the actor shared, "The way that my character best serviced the film was being kind of an emotional sounding board for John Connor." Following in the footsteps of Linda Hamilton as Sarah Connor in the Terminator franchise was never going to be easy for any actress. Hamilton gave a performance so layered and compelling that even the most talented performers have struggled to do the character justice. The first to give it a shot was Lena Headey, who was cast in the role in the short-lived TV series Terminator: The Sarah Connor Chronicles. Fox canceled the show after 2 seasons, citing its high cost as a reason. But Headey's Game of Thrones colleague Emilia Clarke was willing to give it another go on the silver screen for Terminator Genisys. The film was a box office dud, and was heavily criticized for using the old time travel chestnut to rewrite the beginning of the Terminator story to suit the filmmaker's purposes. The main problem wasn't the infuriatingly muddled timeline, though, it was the casting. As much as TV lovers might dig Clarke's portrayal of Daenerys Targaryen in Game of Thrones, the film crowd was decidedly not wowed by her run as Sarah Connor, where her line deliveries packed a lot less punch than the original.
Come with me if you want to live!
Pass. One of the few things that Terminator Genisys did well was recreate the opening sequence from the original James Cameron movie. From the de-aged Arnold Schwarzenegger to the rebuilt sets, the 1984 sequence is an exquisite duplication that totally holds up to the original. Of course, Genisys diverges from there, with the biggest change being the lack of 80s action icon Michael Biehn.
Come with me if you want to live.
While Emilia Clarke sort of resembles Linda Hamilton's Sarah Connor, Jai Courtney looks absolutely nothing like the Kyle Reese we're used to. To its credit, 2009's Terminator Salvation featured a younger version of the character, one that still embodied the Kyle we all know and love.
Come with me if you want to live.
But Courtney, who lacks a certain kind of charisma, doesn't translate well at all. Unfortunately, Genisys was already a mess and a half to begin with, and a planned series of movies was quickly canceled after the movie faced an increasingly negative reception. Unsurprisingly, Kyle Reese hasn't appeared in a Terminator movie since.
Have you heard the one about the two Beckys? When Roseanne kicked off its first iteration back in 1988, it was actor Lacey Goranson who originated the role of Becky, the eldest child to Dan and Roseanne. Fast forward to season 5 though, and Goranson had enrolled in college, and as a result, she was only available to film part-time, usually for a phone conversation. The following year, producers wanted Becky back in a more permanent role, so they recast her with Sarah Chalke. That was fine, but things got complicated when Goranson briefly returned in season 8 after finishing school. The following year, Chalke was back in the role, and the two Beckys became a running thing that frustrated some viewers. To their relief, both actors were asked back for the Roseanne revival in 2018, but only Goranson returned to play Becky. Producers hired Chalke to instead play a character named Andrea, who asked Becky to be her surrogate in a clever wink to the whole situation. For 5.5 seasons, Nashville fans followed Connie Britton's superstar character, Raina James, as she balanced motherhood, singing, and reconnecting with her one true love, Deacon Claiborne. But that all came crashing down when Britton shocked fans and exited the series in 2017 with a devastating storyline that left her family all alone. It turned out Britton was ready for a change, but she was having a hard time of letting go of the people she worked with. So when CMT revived Nashville for a 5th season after ABC axed it at the end of its run in 2016, Britton decided it was finally time to move on. After the fictional singer's death, there were plenty of other characters to root for, and the show may have ultimately survived. But then the writers introduced Caitlin Doubleday as Jessie Kane, a new love interest for Deacon, and loyal fans were definitely not happy. The series took a bit of a dive, and season 6 ultimately wound up being the last. Today, Beverly Hills 90210 is also known as TV's most famous zip code, but before the show earned that status, its original cast had to win over primetime fans with its older actors and soapy storylines. Enter Jason Priestley and Shannon Doherty as the famous Walsh twins, Brandon and Brenda. From the start, fans were into their chemistry with the show's other original cast members. But behind the scenes, it was a different story. Reports of on-set tension between Doherty and the rest of the cast, specifically Jenny Garth, surfaced, and in 1994, Doherty was axed from the show for good. That year, she was replaced by Tiffany Thiessen, who had her own fan base from her days as Kelly on Saved by the Bell. But not all fans were into the new character, Valerie Malone, a family friend of the Walshes. It was clear Val was meant to replace Brenda, but Saved by the Bell fans weren't sure how to receive this new adult version of the actor. Meanwhile, the character had her moments, but she was no Brenda, and the tone of the series changed with her casting. She stayed on for most of the rest of the series, but to this day, you can ask any 90210 fan which character they relate to most, and you probably won't find many Valerie stans out there. Throughout its 8-season run, House had a history of replacing characters to switch up the storyline and keep things fresh. But season 7 is when the casting situation really got out of control. That year, Olivia Wilde took a leave of absence from her fan-favorite gig as 13 to film Cowboys and Aliens, while original actor Lisa Edelstein announced her departure as Dr. Lisa Cuddy. Considering the shakeups, it seemed pretty clear to longtime fans that the series was nearing its expiration date. To try and inject new life into the show, producers hired Odette Annable and Charlene Yee to play the latest fellows alongside Amber Tamblyn, but the new crew never quite lived up to the original cast. And as season 8 was in progress, Fox announced that it would also be the show's last.
1981's The Clash of the Titans attempted to give Greek mythology the Star Wars treatment, taking the story of Perseus and turning it into a sprawling epic. Director Desmond Davis went with Harry Hamlin in the role of Perseus, a son of Zeus, who in legend beheads the Gorgon Medusa in order to save his beloved Princess Andromeda from a giant kraken. Hamlin remains active in the industry, though he's still arguably best remembered for his turn as Perseus. The same cannot be said for Sam Worthington, best known as the star of James Cameron's budding Avatar franchise. Director Louis Leterrier entrusted the Australian with the lead role in his 2010 remake, though his choice was called into question when the negative reviews started to pour in. Worthington's earned his share of acclaim over the years, but the Titans remake is one release he most likely wouldn't mind leaving off his resume. QuickFlix's Simon Murado questioned how Worthington had ever managed to become a Hollywood actor after watching his performance as Perseus, in which he does nothing but glare. His battle speeches are neither rousing nor particularly intelligible. The first RoboCop stars Peter Weller as the titular cyborg. He roams a dystopian, crime-ridden version of Detroit, mercilessly dealing with lawbreakers. Weller reprised the role in RoboCop 2, but turned down the chance to play him again in a third movie. Producers needed a replacement, and their hearts were apparently set on a little-known actor named Robert John Burke. In a 2015 interview, Burke said, "In God's great earth, they thought I was the only actor who could do it. I don't know why. I think physically I poked like Peter Weller, and I had also had extensive karate training, pantomime training, and body training, and I fit the suit." Unsurprisingly, handing the lead role over to the relatively inexperienced Burke just because he kind of resembled Weller didn't work out very well. He may have looked like him in the suit, but as the New York Times said in its review of the box office bomb, Burke is lacking his forerunner's tongue-in-cheek glint of authoritarian machismo.
You have the right to an attorney?
What is it?
From his delivery to the way he moved, Burke just wasn't as convincing as RoboCop. As Empire noted, he appeared to be a lot less comfortable with the hardware. Despite its name, 1984's Friday the 13th Part 4, The Final Chapter, was far from the last installment in this long-running horror franchise. In fact, 8 more films have been made since the so-called Final Chapter, though the one that directly followed it marked a major drop-off in quality. Part 4 has been described as one of the last really excellent horror romps that focus on character, dynamic, and family. Felix Vasquez of Cinema Crazed praised Corey Feldman for his standout performance as young Tommy Jarvis. Feldman went on to make a name for himself in The Goonies, Stand By Me, and The Lost Boys, though before he did, he reprised his Friday the 13th role in 1985's Part 5, A New Beginning. Unfortunately, he only appeared in the prologue, and a time jump meant he was replaced by the painfully dull John Shepard. Teenage Tommy was static compared to his younger self, though Shepard shouldn't shoulder the blame entirely. Some blamed what they called the ham-fisted directing of David Steinman, while James Kendrick of Q Network argued that the gory antics are so restrained by the insistence of the MPAA rating system that the film feels like it was edited with one of Jason's bloody rusty weapons.
Some movies should never be remade. We don't need another Citizen Kane, Casablanca, or Vertigo, for example, and we certainly didn't need another Psycho. What's worse is that director Gus Van Sant chose to remake the film nearly shot for shot, even copying some of Alfred Hitchcock's signature camera movements. It's unsettling to be sure, but maybe that was the point. In any case, Anthony Perkins, who gave a straight-up iconic performance in the 1960 original, can't be easily overshadowed. So when Vince Vaughn was cast as Norman Bates in the remake, folks were understandably skeptical. Given Vaughn's usual filmography, his casting in Psycho made for something of a strange choice. As Roger Ebert wrote, "He isn't odd enough. Norman's early dialogue often ends in a nervous laugh. Vaughn's laugh doesn't seem involuntary." When all is said and done, Vaughn's Norman is still a psycho, but he's a strange and unlayered one at best, and not nearly as frightening as Perkins' original. Like the rest of Van Sant's Psycho remake, Vaughn's performance proves the folly in trying to reinvent the wheel. When director Ridley Scott signed on to direct the Silence of the Lambs sequel, he did so without his Clarice Starling in place. Anthony Hopkins had already negotiated a return to the role of Hannibal Lecter, but Jodie Foster didn't share his enthusiasm for the second chapter in the serial killer's story, despite winning an Oscar for the role in the first film. She later told Total Film, "The official reason I didn't do Hannibal is I was doing another movie, Flora Plum. So I get to say, in a nice, dignified way, that I wasn't available when that movie was being shot. But Clarice meant so much to Lambs director Jonathan Demme and I, there was no way that either of us could really trample on her."
Now that's really interesting, Clarice. I'm really pressed for time.
Several big-name actresses were considered to take her place, and the part ultimately went to Julianne Moore. While both Scott and Hopkins were happy with the choice, audiences weren't as convinced. Moore was inevitably compared to Foster and couldn't measure up to her predecessor's screen savvy, nor rekindle the creepy connection Clarice had shared with Hopkins in the first film. Jodie Foster offered her own diplomatic but shady take on the film, saying simply, "I saw Hannibal. I won't comment."
Sleepy Hollow, Fox's supernatural police drama, was always a little bit different than other cop shows. For starters, one of its main characters was Ichabod Crane from Washington Irving's short story The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, who comes back to life in the present day after having died 200 years or so prior. Crane then helps fight supernatural menaces alongside Police Lieutenant Abby Mills. Over 3 seasons, Sleepy Hollow settled into its role as a quirky police procedural, and then it did the unthinkable. Abby died, and actress Nicole Beharie left the series. Despite Despite a steep loss of viewers from Season 1 to Season 3, Sleepy Hollow returned for a 4th season without Abby. Ichabod was now partnered with a Homeland Security agent named Diana Thomas. The cast reboots didn't do Sleepy Hollow any favors though. The show fell even further in the ratings and was soon cancelled. For the Fox television adaptation of Lethal Weapon, Clayne Crawford took over for Mel Gibson as loose cannon Martin Riggs. And if on-set reports published by Variety are any indication, Crawford was even harder to control than his character. In an episode he directed, a special effects explosion went awry, sending a piece of debris at co-star Damon Wayans. When Wayans complained, Crawford referred to his co-star as a crybaby. Another time he reportedly screamed and swore at a group of children who wandered near. On yet another occasion, he reportedly proved so hard to work with that a director walked off the set in the middle of a shoot. In May 2018, after 2 seasons, producers eliminated what they thought was the root cause of the show's problems and fired Crawford. They rushed to find somebody to replace him and quickly hired Sean William Scott to play Wesley Cole, a new partner for Detective Roger Murtaugh. Scott couldn't save the show, however. All that tension didn't totally dissipate, with Wayans announcing that he planned to leave the series in the middle of the season. Fox decided to wash their hands of the whole thing in May 2019 and cancelled Lethal Weapon. NewsRadio, NBC's critically acclaimed but low-watched comedy, had no plans to replace one of its characters and best-known star, but tragedy forced the producer's hand. Between the show's 4th and 5th season, star Phil Hartman was shot to death by his troubled wife. It was a horrific crime and a devastating loss for the show. But in order to complete enough episodes to sell the show into syndication, NewsRadio was picked up for another season anyway. In the season premiere, it was explained that Hartman's character, pompous radio newsreader Bill McNeil, died of a sudden heart attack. Replacing him at the newsreader's desk was a new character, Max Lewis. Weird, insecure, and wholly unqualified for the position, Max was portrayed by Hartman's friend and Saturday Night Live co-star John Lovitz. While Lovitz is a great comic actor, he just couldn't overcome the sadness looming over NewsRadio. Lovitz's first season would be the show's last.
Michael J. Fox returned to regular series television for the first time since the end of Family Ties with Spin City. On the ABC sitcom, he played Mike Flaherty, a wheeler dealer for a New York City deputy mayor. 2 years later, Fox announced that he had been battling Parkinson's disease and left the show to spend more time raising funds for research on the disease. Replacing him as deputy mayor was a guy named Charlie Crawford, portrayed by Charlie Sheen. With Fox out, the show became more of a romantic comedy surrounding Sheen and Heather Locklear's characters. But viewership tanked shortly after the replacement, so ABC cut the cord on Spin City.
I guess you guys aren't ready for that yet. But your kids are gonna love it.
Major League was a surprise grand slam for Paramount Pictures and produced 2 increasingly terrible sequels. And while Charlie Sheen's Wild Thing came back for a second round at the mound in Major League 2, there was another standout actor from the first film who refused to run the bases of this franchise again. Wesley Snipes, whose charming swagger as the speedy base thief was a home run in the first movie, had no interest in returning to the dugout for the second movie. At the time, he was well on his way to becoming a Hollywood MVP in his own right, thanks to movies like White Men Can't Jump and Demolition Man, so he pretty much priced himself out of the second movie. With the Cleveland Indians down a man on their roster, the filmmakers turned to relative newcomer Omar Epps to sub in as a pinch runner for the project. Unfortunately, Epps didn't have a strong background in comedy, and his performance was the cinematic equivalent of a foul ball.
Read some of your reviews, man. One guy said Willie Mays Hayes couldn't play dead.
Just a bit outside. There was plenty of controversy surrounding the making of the animated movie Scoob, a reboot feature meant to kickstart a new theatrical Scooby-Doo franchise. Between unceremoniously canceled sequels and the film's failed attempt to launch a cinematic universe, the biggest problem with Scoob was its casting. Despite retaining Frank Welker as the iconic voice of Scooby-Doo, the rest of the Mystery Inc. gang was scrapped for this installment, including Matthew Lillard's Shaggy Rogers. Lillard gained widespread acclaim when he played Shaggy in the 2 live-action Scooby-Doo movies in the early 2000s. He went on to take over vocal duties from Casey Kasem for subsequent animated movies and television productions. To this day, Lillard still plays Shaggy as faithfully as ever, but he missed out on the 2020 return to the big screen. After the film's cast was revealed, Lillard took to X, formerly known as Twitter, to write, "Well, this sucks. What a crappy way to find out. Thanks, Hollywood." Of course, Lillard wasn't the only one replaced in the new movie, nor was he the only one disappointed by the news. But given his many years playing Shaggy, it was tough news nonetheless. And it didn't help that Will Forte's Shaggy just sounded like a higher-pitched Will Forte rather than Shaggy. Thankfully, Lillard has since resumed voicing Shaggy in all other Scooby-Doo projects. Can you believe that there have been no fewer than 6 Home Alone movies? Obviously, the first 2, directed by Chris Columbus and starring Macaulay Culkin, are the best by far. Over the years, Home Alone and Lost in New York have become Christmas classics, while the other less inventive sequels simply rode the franchise's coattails.
You guys give up, or you're thirsty for more?
But though most of the sequels feature a new protagonist in the place of young Kevin, the direct-to-video Home Alone 4 opted to resurrect the original lead, albeit without Culkin's involvement. The 4th film takes place seemingly a few years after Lost in New York, with the McAllister family in complete disarray. And not just because they've all been recast, too. Here, Kevin is played by Mike Weinberg, who isn't nearly as charismatic or lovable as Culkin, though he does look younger. In fact, if the character's name had been changed, you'd have no clue that this was supposed to be the same kid. No doubt, Culkin was looked over because Home Alone 4 was released 12 years after the original. But that's no excuse. As the Radio Times review says, you have to wonder why they bothered. Not only was Home Alone 4 destined to be a train wreck after a poor 3rd installment, but trying to capitalize on the McAllister family without utilizing any returning faces turned out to be nothing short of a disaster. Let's chalk it all up to real Kevin's bad dream. After the commercial success of the 1994 live-action adaptation of the Flintstones, a sequel was certainly on the cards at Universal Pictures. So, when another live-action Flintstones, titled The Flintstones in Viva Rock Vegas, showed up in theaters 6 years later, nobody was particularly surprised. The first film had been panned by critics, but the second, well, that was a real disaster. For starters, Viva Rock Vegas is a prequel rather than a sequel, and the movie recasts its comedic leads. The original movie starred John Goodman as Fred, Rick Moranis as Barney, Elizabeth Perkins as Wilma, and Rosie O'Donnell as Betty. Viva Rock Vegas starred Mark Addy as Fred, Stephen Baldwin as Barney, Kristen Johnson as Wilma, and Jane Krakowski as Betty. To say that any of these actors are untalented on their own would be untrue, but that doesn't mean they were the right folks for the job. While The Flintstones was no masterpiece itself, the lack of comedic timing, uninspired jokes, and lackluster cast of the sequel hardly set it up for success. As Roger Ebert wrote, minute by weary minute, the movie wins its weary way toward its joyless conclusion. No wonder a 3rd live-action Flintstones has never materialized. The 90s marked a moment of resurgence for Disney's animated film collection, with films like Beauty and the Beast and The Lion King offering a new generation of children some cartoon movies to sing along to. One of Disney's most beloved films of the era was Aladdin, an Oscar-winning take on the Arabic folktale about the street thief who sheds his rags and won the heart of a princess. Aladdin was packed full of great musical numbers, but the main reason it became such a smash was the input of the late Robin Williams as the genie.
It's all part and parcel of the whole genie gig.
Phenomenal cosmic powers!
Itty-bitty living space.
The actor confirmed that he wouldn't be lending his voice to the direct-to-video sequel The Return of Jafar, after an alleged row with Disney over its marketing tactics. So the search for a new genie began. Dan Castellaneta, the legendary voice of Homer Simpson, was ultimately chosen to voice the big blue guy. But the Simpson star just couldn't measure up to Williams' frenetic performance. The quality of the animation didn't help matters, but Castellaneta lacked the unpredictability that Williams brought to the genie, essentially doing a watered-down impression of his predecessor.
Dope!
Delta Burke had not been happy on the set of Designing Women for years. She even claimed that a producer routinely screamed at cast members and told them they were expendable and criticized Burke when she gained weight.
Are you serious?
CBS grew so tired of Burke publicly trashing the show's producers and the network in the press that they fired her from the show. And co-star Jean Smart followed her out the door shortly thereafter.
Every time I look over at the sofa, I kind of miss seeing her.
That meant that Designing Women had lost half its main cast, but the show was still a ratings draw, so the network brought in some replacements.
I know that all of our nerves are a little bit jangly because of this silly old money situation, but you know what we got to do? We got to look for the light.
Julia Duffy arrived as Suzanne's cousin, and Jan Hooks came in as Carlene, Charlene's sister. Despite ratings on par with previous years, CBS fired Duffy after her sole season on the series and replaced her with Judith Ivey as a rich Texan widow named B.J. Poteet. It didn't do much good because CBS moved the show to Friday nights, where it slipped into ratings oblivion and then cancellation.
And that is the night the lights went out in Georgia.
Chemistry is particularly important when casting a family sitcom, so fans were a little concerned when Julia Butters left American Housewife as the youngest Otto child ahead of its 5th season premiere. Butters brought a notable charm to the character of Anna Cat Otto, so much so that when Quentin Tarantino saw her on his screen, he cast her as serious young actress Trudy in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. That gig wound up being a game changer for the young actor because all kinds of subsequent offers came in and she left the ABC series to pursue them. In turn, American Housewife snatched up Giselle Eisenberg, fresh from her 4-season run on the CBS sitcom Life in Pieces. While Eisenberg is undeniably talented, it's been hard for fans to adapt to the change following the show's return in 2020.
Yeah, kids change.
All the witty meta jokes in the world won't convince viewers to keep watching. The season 5 finale ended up being a series finale. ABC canceled American Housewife in 2021.
After the first season of The Facts of Life, the number of main characters was cut from 10 to just 5. Eastland boarding school house mother Mrs. Garrett and 4 female students. After those 4 graduated in the 4th season, Mrs. Garrett opened a gourmet shop and hired her former students. And after season 7, Mrs. Garrett herself, Charlotte Ray, left the show. She thought it was time to move on, later telling Entertainment Weekly that the show could continue on without her. But producers loved the show's dynamic of a wise older woman doling out advice to young women. So they created the role of Mrs. Garrett's sister, Beverly Ann. However, the replacement didn't quite work, and by the 9th season, The Facts of Life was unceremoniously cancelled.
Halloweentown was one of the most beloved Disney Channel features to hit TV screens. In fact, it was so popular with 90s kids that 2 sequels were made in the years following. But then a darker installment came, following Marnie Piper into her college years. Only this time, she wasn't played by the lovable Kimberly J. Brown, as Sarah Paxton instead stepped into the role. Return to Halloweentown was kind of a mess. Though the majority of the original cast returned, Paxton was the odd one out, playing an older Marnie to whom viewers didn't recognize or relate. Strangely, some House of Mouse witchcraft must have been afoot, since there are 2 conflicting accounts of why Brown was recast in the first place. In 2010, Brown told October31st.org, "I wanted to do the 4th one and was fully available for the shoot. Disney decided not to use me for the 4th one. I don't know why. I was definitely disappointed not to do it." But producer Sherry Singer had a different story. In 2017, she told E! Online, "It was not something we wanted to do. We couldn't make the deal work. That was why, and we didn't want to not do it." The Mummy was a surprise smash for Universal, posting global receipts of $415 million and landing on the top 10 highest-grossing films in 1999. It launched Brendan Fraser's career as a Hollywood action hero and introduced the world to a stunning new leading lady in Rachel Weisz. The pair made a compelling on-screen couple and reprised their roles in The Mummy Returns, which managed to bring in a nice haul from the box office as well. But by the time the 3rd film came around, Weisz was suffering from some serious mummy fatigue and stepped aside. Weisz was rumored to call the script for The Mummy 3 crap, so the studio turned to Maria Bello to fill in for the role.
That should give us a good advantage.
Unfortunately for Bello, her turn in the role was criticized for lacking the charm of the original, and the film failed to recoup its production cost in the domestic box office.
Why am I laughing?
Tom Cruise brought the vampire Lestat de Leoncourt to life in the film adaptation of Anne Rice's novel, Interview with the Vampire. Cruise's memorable performance opposite Brad Pitt and a young Kirsten Dunst is certainly a highlight of the film. But did you know there was a sequel? Cruise didn't reprise his vampiric role, however, which is probably why many people haven't heard of it. Instead, Stuart Townsend took over for 2002's Queen of the Damned. Also based on an Anne Rice novel, Queen of the Damned was a complete and utter failure. Not only did the movie tank at the box office, but Rice wasn't particularly thrilled with it either, and no other movies based on the Vampire Chronicles have been released since. While Townsend may have better resembled the character from the novel in terms of physicality, he didn't have the same sort of gravitas that Cruise brought to the role. Film Threat's review of the movie read, "Tom Cruise had the good sense to stay away from reprising his role of Lestat in this film, and audiences should demand this film be buried, never to see the light of day again." While the Mortal Kombat video games and animated movies have done particularly well over the years, translating such a stylized world into live action can prove difficult. So when director Paul W.S. Anderson released his vision in 1995, fans were surprisingly happy with the results. The film starred Christopher Lambert as Raiden, along with an ensemble cast that did a decent job at bringing these characters to life. Unfortunately, he didn't return in the sequel. Years later, Lambert revealed that he didn't like the script for Mortal Kombat Annihilation. And who can blame him? Taking over as Raiden was James Remar, who wasn't exactly notable in the role. Although IGN later admitted that Remar played the part well, the outlet couldn't get past how bad the rest of the movie was, saying, "Hilariously awful matte shots, cheap costumes, obvious sets, and some of the worst CG ever put in a mainstream release fill nearly every scene of this movie." No doubt, Mortal Kombat Annihilation is a total train wreck. And even though James Remar did his best to make his part memorable, it only reminds us of how terrible the rest of the movie is. There are 5 films based on Tom Clancy's Jack Ryan books, but only one actor has played the protagonist twice. Eyebrows were raised when Alec Baldwin was given the boot after he successfully debuted Ryan on screen in The Hunt for Red October. Baldwin later implied that the studio had gone behind his back and entered into negotiations with Ford to take the role of Ryan.
Well, that was a guess, but it seemed logical.
Even so, Ford's performance in Patriot Games and Clear and Present Danger became definitive for the character. 8 years later, another actor stepped in to bring a much younger version of Jack Ryan to the big screen. This time, it was Ben Affleck who stepped in for the sum of all fears. His performance in the role was met with disdain, however, and the Jack Ryan franchise never really recovered after that, despite an attempt to reboot it with Chris Pine in the lead role more than a decade later.
It seems like networks have been trying to recreate the soapy primetime success of Desperate Housewives ever since that show went off the air in 2012. ABC thought it came close with the 2013 entry, Mistresses, which failed to earn critical praise but still snagged a second season renewal following its steamy first season summer run. Fans continued to bake in the hotness of it all the following summer, but when the show was renewed for a third season, ABC revealed it was moving production from Los Angeles to Vancouver. That was bad news for star Alyssa Milano, who couldn't be that far from her family. Milano stepped away as a result, and the show recruited Jennifer Esposito to fill that void with her Callista Raines character. That lasted one season, and then Esposito also left the series in order to pursue other projects. Surprisingly, the show was renewed for one more season, but without Milano, fans just didn't seem that into it, and the series was axed for good after a very dramatic season 4 finale. When the 6th season of this comedy kicked off in 1969, viewers were left twitching harder than Samantha in her magical nose when Emmy nominee Dick York was suddenly gone as Darren Stevens. In his place was Dick Sargent, and fan speculation as to what happened kicked into overdrive. As it turned out, York had previously injured his back pretty badly while shooting a movie, and the pain led him down a dark path of prescription pills. Eventually, he realized he had to leave the show, and his career never really recovered. As for Sargent, he stayed in the role until the series finale in 1972. Many fans felt the series wasn't the same though, and it's worth noting that although Sargent won a Most Irreplaceable Replacement TV Land Award in 2006, he was never nominated for an Emmy Award like his predecessor.
An ensemble drama with a culturally diverse cast set in an often surreal rural Alaska, Northern Exposure was radically different from most other shows on television. Rob Morrow starred as Dr. Joel Fleischman, a snobby New York City doctor who heads north to service the tiny town of Sicily. Northern Exposure was a big hit, reaching the top 20 in the ratings and earning 4 straight Emmy nominations for Outstanding Drama Series and winning the prize in 1992. But Fleischman's desire to leave Alaska never faded, and Morrow wanted to bounce too. Halfway through the show's 6th season, Morrow fled Northern Exposure, reportedly to pursue new acting challenges and a movie career. Replacing him was a new physician, Dr. Philip Capra, portrayed by Paul Provenza, a respected stand-up comedian who had little acting experience apart from his work on sitcoms. That inexperience seems to have showed. After just half a season with Provenza at the helm, the network cancelled Northern Exposure.
Roger Moore and Sean Connery each made 7 appearances as James Bond, though many 007 fans will tell you that Connery is the only Bond. A CBS News poll concluded that 51% of Americans chose Connery as their favorite Bond, with Pierce Brosnan coming in a distant second. George Lazenby, the man who replaced Connery in the role for 1969's On Her Majesty's Secret Service, received just 1% of the vote, which tells you everything you need to know about the gulf between these two actors. While critical opinion toward the film itself has softened over time, Lazenby's performance is still a bone of contention, inevitably compared to those delivered by Connery in the franchise's 5 previous entries. The Chicago Reader said that George Lazenby has so much reserve as James Bond that he makes Sean Connery seem almost frenetic by comparison. Reviews in the UK were just as critical of the leading man's turn as the British Secret Service agent, with London-based outlet Time Out calling him a stunning non-entity, fronting a film with no redeeming features. Veteran film critic Mark Kermode summed up 2015's The Transporter Refueled with a single question. What exactly is the point of a Transporter movie without Jason Statham? When it was revealed that Ed Skrein was to replace Statham as Special Forces op turned private driver Frank Martin in the 4th Transporter film, questions were raised about the former's ability to carry the franchise forward. Though the Transporter films didn't exactly change the action movie landscape, they benefited from Statham's presence, athletic prowess, and combat skills. His replacement lacked that experience, and it showed. Skrein began taking classes in various martial arts disciplines as he prepared for both The Transporter Refueled and his role as Ajax in Deadpool, but even he acknowledged that he was way behind many of his peers in that department. He told the BBC, "I'm very respectful and realize I'm not going to be able to do things meant for 10 or 20 years of training." The action in The Transporter Refueled was ultimately limited by the new star's fledgling abilities. Ed Skrein's one and only outing as Frank Martin was a commercial and critical flop that left the Luc Besson-produced franchise dead in the water. Rooney Mara took the role of androgynous computer hacker Lisbeth Salander, starring opposite Daniel Craig in 2011's The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. When the 2018 sequel, The Girl in the Spider's Web, was announced, fans of David Fincher's critically acclaimed first film were a little disappointed that both Mara and Craig had been recast, and so was Mara. She told Yahoo, "I was hopeful to come back, but they decided to do a different thing. It was always a character I wanted to revisit, but that's not what happened." Sever Gudnason replaced Daniel Craig, while Claire Foy stepped into the pale, pierced skin of Salander. Unfortunately, she didn't look comfortable in it. At the time, she was receiving acclaim for her turn as the young Queen Elizabeth II in The Crown, but Foy couldn't pull off Salander's cold eccentricities with the same poise as her predecessor. Critics were by and large unimpressed with her version of the goth hacker, with many questioning why she was chosen for the part. The Observer's Wendy Ide said, "Much as I admire her, Foy is miscast here. She's just too empathetic for a role that requires an almost reptilian lack of emotion." IndieWire's senior film critic David Ehrlich called her both terrible and terribly miscast.
Nobody took over Keanu Reeves' role as Officer Jack Traven from the 90s action classic Speed, but the Lost Boys legend Jason Patric replaced him as the male lead for its sequel, Speed 2: Cruise Control. Reeves instead chose to pursue other action roles, which eventually led to the likes of Constantine and John Wick. But with Reeves out for the count and Patrick stepping in as Officer Alex Shaw, Speed 2 could only end in a wreck. And wreck it did. Many cited Patrick's performance in the screenplay as some of the film's biggest issues. Time magazine's review said, "He's stalwart and athletic, but fundamentally uninteresting." Others, including original Speed star Sandra Bullock, wished they could forget about Cruise Control entirely. Interestingly, Reeves is apparently open to returning as Jack Traven one day. While promoting John Wick Chapter 4, Reeves told Access Hollywood that a great story and a great script would convince him to come back for Speed 3.
Dallas had its fair share of character replacements during its run from 1978 to 1991, as any show that airs for 14 seasons inevitably does. But one that still stands out with fans to this day is the role of Miss Ellie Ewing. Barbara Bel Geddes originated the part and played it right up until 1984, when she left in order to have a quadruple bypass heart surgery. At the time, she was replaced by Donna Reed, and fans were not into it. In fact, fans were so not into it that 6 months later, when Bel Geddes had recovered, she was asked back onto the show. Reed didn't go down without a fight though. She tried to sue and halt production. In the end, the judge didn't agree with her and the series carried on. Bel Geddes continued playing Miss Ewing for the remainder of the series, bringing life to the character for over 300 episodes.
The high school sitcom Head of the Class debuted on ABC in 1986. It explored the relationships between a diverse group of highly advanced Manhattan students and their history teacher Charlie Moore, played by Howard Hessman. A big part of why Head of the Class worked is that it was ensemble-focused. The various kids had personal and academic problems, and Mr. Moore helped them sort things out. Hessman portrayed Moore with understatement and subtlety, letting his younger co-stars take center stage. However, the actor hated Head of the Class. In 1989, he told a reporter that he thought the show didn't have much worth. He said, "We're not doing the show that I was led to believe I'd do, and it's difficult for me to get off that." Unsurprisingly, Hessman left the show in 1990. In his place was Scottish comedian Billy Connolly as a teacher named Billy McGregor. All of a sudden, a show about high school kids' problems was a show about wacky Mr. McGregor. ABC seemed to realize that too. In 1991, the network cancelled Head of the Class and quickly ordered up a new show called Billy. Connolly continued to play McGregor, who was now living as a boarder in a California single mother's house.
1988's Big is often cited as Tom Hanks' breakout movie, but he actually announced himself as a potential star some 4 years earlier in Ron Howard's fantasy rom-com, Splash. Hanks plays Alan Bauer, a young man who returns to the spot of what he believes was a near-death hallucination to discover that the woman he saw in the water the day he almost drowned is indeed real. Alan falls for Mermaid Madison and ditches his life on land to live under the sea with her in a goofy yet undeniably feel-good ending. It's a beloved movie, though the same cannot be said about the obscure made-for-TV sequel, Splash 2. Helmed by writer, director, and actor Greg Antonacci, the highly forgettable and completely unnecessary Splash 2 brought Alan and Madison back to dry land, totally ignoring the fact that the government wanted to lock her up in a lab in the previous installment. Todd Waring took over as Alan Bauer, but despite his best efforts, he lacked the everyman charm and comedic timing that was abundant in Hanks. FilmFad said in its review of the sequel, "The less said about the actors replacing Tom Hanks and John Candy, the better."
National Lampoon's Van Wilder isn't going to be preserved in the Library of Congress National Film Registry anytime soon. Yet, for all of its failings, fans of a certain age remember this movie fondly. This was a time when frat humor was at its peak, and sitting down to watch a comedy usually meant turning your brain off for 90 minutes. Van Wilder might not have been the most cerebral comedy of all time, but Ryan Reynolds still delivered as the fast-talking cool guy who threw the best parties and was a softie underneath all those crazy antics. After the Kal Penn-led sequel was destroyed by critics, the producers decided their next move was a prequel featuring a younger version of Van Wilder. So they brought in Mean Girls' Jonathan Bennett for Van Wilder freshman year, which was a terrible mistake.
I have never seen such a sorry display in all my life.
The actor couldn't come close to the charisma of his predecessor and produced a feature-length, failed impression effort as a result. Sometimes, movies reference the fact that a certain actor has been recast.
Hey, buddy. Didn't expect to see you here.
Look, it's me. I'm here. Deal with it. Let's move on.
Occasionally, a movie even takes pains to explain the change in actor. It could have been a dream, plastic surgery, or some other strange off-screen development. And every now and again, they just straight up admit they couldn't afford the real deal. That was the case with George of the Jungle 2. In the first movie, George was played by the ever-talented Brendan Fraser. But for Disney's direct-to-video sequel, Christopher Showerman took over the titular role. And the filmmakers weren't shy about admitting it.
Me knew George. Studio too cheap to pay Brendan Fraser.
Of course, George isn't the only character recast in the sequel. Julie Benz replaced Leslie Mann as Ursula Stanhope as well. Strangely, Thomas Hayden Church reprised his role as Lyle Vandegroot from the first film, even though his presence couldn't save this one. If the direct-to-video budget didn't give it away, George of the Jungle 2 is full of bad CGI, a retread of the film's first plot, and of course, absolutely no Brendan Fraser in sight. In a review from DVD Verdict, Showerman was described as a non-entity who only serves as an imitation of Brendan Fraser's interpretation of George.